Good day to each and everyone. I'm Kenna Comora Redobla from BSED English 2B, and I'm going to discuss the fantasy under children's literature. So the definition of fantasy is the genre of imaginative fiction involving magic and adventure, especially in a setting other than the real world.
The characteristics of fantasy: settings, characters, plots, themes, and tone. Settings transcend the world of reality. The fantasy world is vividly and convincingly, regardless of how fantastical it may be. Characters are well developed and behave in believable ways. Plots are well structured and believable too. They have logical actions. Themes reflect the same universal ideas presented in other forms of children's literature. Themes are woven into the story and develop metaphorically through the characters and their actions. Tone is often serious, though stories are often light, airy, and humorous. Fantasy is perfectly suited to the thoughtful exploration of philosophical issues at a level that can be understood and appreciated by the child reader. So let's move on to the categories of fantasy: the traditional fantasy and modern fantasy. The definition of traditional fantasy is that literature originated orally and has no author. For example, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected, retold, and recorded in print the European variants of some of the best-known traditional tales in Western culture, such as Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Little Red Riding Hood. The peculiarities of traditional fantasy. Traditional stories differ in various ways from modern writings and therefore are held to a different critical standard. Characters must be well developed in modern stories, but in traditional tales, character development is lean and spare. For example, the Cinderella. Traditional tales, then, are stories of the human experience told in primary colors. Plots are also simple and direct in traditional fantasy. They are often stories that show the underdog making good, and success is often obtained against overwhelming odds, such as accomplishing an impossible task. Storylines are accompanied by typical themes, such as the rewards of mercy, kindness, and perseverance, justice, particularly the punishment of evil, and the power of love. Another hallmark of traditional fantasy is repeated patterns or elements. For example, the magical number 3 appears frequently in tales. Rumpelstiltskin, 3 evenings of spinning straw into gold. Cinderella's 3 visit to the ball. Next is the type of traditional fantasy. The first type of traditional fantasy is the folktales or stories of the people. They are called folk because they are part of the oral tradition handed down from generation to generation by the folk. Under this is the cumulative tales. These stories are added upon as the telling unfolds. The story is told up to a certain point, then begun again from near the beginning and told until the new segment is added. For example is, I know an old lady. I know an old lady who swallowed a cow. I don't know how she swallowed a cow. She swallowed the cow to catch the goat. She swallowed the goat to catch the dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wriggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. Next is the Porky Tales. These folktales answer questions or give explanation for the way things are, particularly in nature. For example is, why mosquitoes buzz in people's ear. Next is the Beast Tales, are stories with animals as the principal players. For example, the 3 Little Pigs and the 3 Billy Goats Gruff. Next is the Noodlehead or Numbskull Tales. These numerous stories center on the escapades of characters who are not too bright. For example, Epaminondas and Hans in Luck. The Trickster Tales, often a variety of Beast Tales, the Trickster's Tales features a character who outmarks everyone else in the story. For example,
the bear, rabbit from the Uncle Remus stories. Next is the realistic tales. Realistic tales seem to have their basis in an actual historical event or an actual figure from history. For example, Dick Whittington's cat. Next is the fairy tales. Of all the folk tales, the fairy tale or wonder tale is the most magical. In fairy tales, we see enchantments that go beyond talking animals to fairy godmothers, wicked witches, magical objects, and the like. For example, the Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin and his Wonderlamp. The next types of traditional fantasy is the tall tales. Exaggeration is the major stylistic element in tall tales. Tall characters were based either on actual people or on a composite of rough and tumble lumberjacks, sailors, and cowboys. For example, the Seven Chinese Brothers. The next types of traditional fantasy is the fables. Fables are brief stories meant to teach a lesson, and they usually conclude with a moral such as haste makes waste. For example, collection of Aesop's fables. The fourth types of traditional fantasy is the myth. Myth grows out of people's need to understand and explain the world around them and their own existence. They therefore recount the creation and tell of the god and goddesses who control the fate of human. For example, in the beginning, creation stories from around the world, 1988. Next types of traditional fantasy are the epics, ballads, and legends. Epics are lengthy hero tales or even a series of tales focusing on a hero. For example, is the Iliad and the Odyssey. Ballads are typically hero stories on poetic form. For example, is the Iliad and the Odyssey. Legends. The heroes on legends are rooted a bit more firmly in history. For example, is the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad could be considered an epic and a legendary ballad. Another example, King Arthur also lives in epic, ballad, and legend. The next types of traditional fantasy is the religious stories. Stories derived from the sacred writings of Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and other religions of the world contribute to this arena of traditional literature. Example of this is the Babushka and the Three Kings. Buddha Stories, 1997, and The Earth Trembled in 1996. Modern fantasy. Modern fantasy is distinguished from other genres by story elements that violate the natural physical laws of our known world events akin to magic. However, unlike traditional fantasy, it has known authors. The categories of modern fantasy. Modern fantasy is often categorized by the type of fantastic story element employed. First is the toys and object imbued with life. Example is Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. The second is tiny humans. Example is The Borrowers by Mary Norton. Third is peculiar characters and situations. Example of this is The Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers. Next is imaginary worlds. Example of this is the Alice in the Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Another category of modern fantasy is the magical powers. Example of this is the Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling. Another is supernatural tales. Example of this is the Wait Till Helen Comes, a ghost story by Mary Downing. Another categories of modern fantasy is the time warp fantasies. Example of this is the Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Peirce. And lastly, the high fantasy. Example of this is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. So let's move on to 6 basic motifs of fantasy. The first basic motifs of fantasy is the magic. Magic is fantasy literature's most basic element. Second is other worlds or secondary worlds. In much of fantasy, a special geography or universe is established, a place wherein magic may freely operate. The third basic motifs of fantasy is the good versus evil. This basic theme gives a rise to the conflict in a story. Fourth is heroism. The hero's quest will always follow an old age pattern that is the backbone of many of the today's fantasy stories. The fifth basic motifs of fantasy is the special character types. Fantasies may include characters who came from either our legendary past or an author's vivid imagination. The last basic motifs of fantasy is the fantastic object. Characters in fantasy stories often imply magical props in accomplishing heroic or evil deeds. This object includes the magic locks, swords, staffs, cloud runs, and mirrors are imbued with power. For example, Harry Potter's flying broom. Science fiction. Fiction differs from fantasy not in subject matter but in aim, and its unique aim is to suggest real hypotheses about mankind's future or about the nature or the universe. It is according to Engdahl, 1971. The value of fantasy. First, it gives the readers the shared delight of let's pretend. Second, fantasy has the ability to work our emotions with same vividness as a dream. Another value of fantasy is its ability to develop a capacity for belief. The fourth value of fantasy is fantasy casts light on the realities of life much as a metaphor illustrates truth in general communication. In its broad definition, metaphor is a figurative language and strengthens writing in at least three ways. First is metaphor speeds understanding. Second, metaphor creates interest. And last, metaphor adds emotional appeal. So that's all for my report. Thank you so much for watching. God bless.